In this presentation today. My name is Tom Chavez. I am a counseling psychologist in the School of Medicine at UNM and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences with Community Behavioral Health. And I will briefly mention here that I use critical frameworks in most of the work that I do to make sure that I introduce the concepts of history or address the historical and cultural context, and of course issues of power that come into play, and trying to make things that are oftentimes left invisible more visible, and moving beyond Eurocentric perspectives in terms of understanding behavioral health issues. And so before I get started, just make sure you sign in, etc. We'll have the QR code at the end of this presentation. And once you complete and submit your evaluation, you'll have your CE sent to you. And I have nothing to disclose. Views are particularly of mine, not necessarily of that of New Mexico, UNM. That being said, the objectives today essentially are to provide a general 101 on LGBTQAI plus identities. I'll use the word queer just to kind of use the umbrella term here. And we'll also examine sociocultural determinants of health and well-being specific to the queer communities. And I will explore the social and cultural determinants of health and well-being among our queer communities. And so, and finally, I'll talk a little bit about developing safe spaces and approaches to working with LGBTQAI plus communities. And as I mentioned, historical context is really important. And I just want to start off with colonial thought and talk a little bit about pre-colonial thought. But during the Enlightenment, scientists and physicians adopted a two-sex model that treated male and female bodies as opposites and the only two options. The idea of gender as a fixed and unchangeable characteristic determined by biological sex became more entrenched during this time. And then during colonialism, some studies argue that European colonialism introduced this harmful gender-based roles and behaviors and enforced a binary system of gender to maintain patriarchal norms and uphold European nationalism. During the 19th century, there was the emergence of the concept of sexuality further solidified, by categorizing individuals based solely on sexual behavior and sexual desires. And so really focusing on desires and behaviors. And so, but pre-colonial thought, and just some examples here, indigenous communities around the globe, non-Western European perspectives. For example, Egypt, Yoruba tribes found mostly in present-day Nigeria did not have this binary system of gender, and typically did not assign the gender to babies at birth, and instead waited until later in life. Also, similarly, within our state of New Mexico, Zuni Pueblo, this is a picture of Wiwa. So she was born in Zuni tribe around 1849. Born a male-bodied person, community members recognized that Wiwa demonstrated traits associated with Ihamana as early as age 3 or 4. And so in Zuni culture, Ihamana, which is generally termed as two-spirited nowadays, were male-bodied individuals who took on social and ceremonial roles, generally performed by women. So they usually, though not exclusively, wore women's clothing and mostly took up labors associated with women. Lahamana constituted a socially recognized third gender role within the tribe and often held positions of honor in the community. But she left a profound legacy as a ceremonial leader, cultural ambassador, and an artist who worked to preserve the Zuni way of life. And on the right side picture here, we have a picture of a muhe of Mexico, of Zapotec indigenous background, a tribe of southern Mexico, or Oaxaca. So they were persons who appeared to be predominantly male, but displayed certain female characteristics and fill a third gender role between men and women, taking some of the characteristics of each. So today, scientists believe in both nature and nurture that influence gender and sexuality. So in terms of biological factors like genes and prenatal hormones are likely involved. And so research suggests a complex interplay of genes, but hasn't identified a single quote unquote gay gene or definitive genetic cause. And so that's where we turn to nurture, or environmental factors like social experiences and upbringing can also play a role. However, sexual orientation isn't considered a choice influenced by the environment. So whether it's biological or socialization, it is still not considered a quote unquote a choice. So the exact balance of nature and nurture in each case is still being explored, and it's likely a complex interaction that unfolds throughout a person's lifetime. And historically, homosexuality has been considered a pathology or social deviance, with heterosexuality seen as normative. From that standpoint, there has been a focus on the causes of such deviance and ways to treat such deviance. With greater understanding, however, of the queer communities, the question has shifted to how we can address the health and mental health needs of the population. And so I'll provide a little bit of a background here as I move along. And so essentially, I will briefly discuss each of the theories of pathology, developmental immaturity, and theories that highlight normal variation of sexual behavior. So going back to the labels of homosexuality and heterosexuality, those are medical terms. And so gender and sexuality has been medicalized, and once again, often pathologized and seen as a symptom of disease caused by either internal defects or external prenatal and postnatal factors. Australian-born American psychoanalyst Bergler, among others, had this particular perspective on homosexuality. And he claimed to have no bias against homosexuals, but viewed them as sick. So characterizations of homosexuals, characterizing them as disagreeable, supercilious, if you will, behaving or looking as though one thinks one is superior to others, considering them displaying a superficial hostility or aggression, not genuine or not deeply felt. So suggesting that such aggression is a facade or a defense mechanism to mask these underlying insecurities or vulnerabilities. And this whole idea about whimpering or display of weakness and vulnerability, often compared to masochists or psychic masochists, if you will. And so the main point of this, again, it's about pathologizing non-heterosexual communities. And also rooted in early psychoanalysis, developmental theories as an alternative to the pathology or disease models still perpetuated perspectives of homosexuality as seen from the norm, essentially seeing it as an arrest in development. So this is generally where we get the idea that homosexuality is a passing phase. Although it's a less stigmatizing view, it still holds heterosexual development or heterosexual development as the norm. And finally, we have normal variations as a thought here. So seen as a natural difference, resisting deviance, deficient disease models. So less emphasis on pathology perspectives. And in that way, there's no place for it within the DSM. Such a label of homosexuality should not be characterized as pathological within the DSM that we use to this very day. As we know, there's much scientific support on natural variation among humans, but also among other species and cultures around the globe. Which brings us to the spectrum. I know that we would like to keep things simple, through that binary most oftentimes. When it comes to understanding human behavior, we play these dichotomies quite often. And in this case of gender and sexuality and sexual orientation, Many people still try to subscribe to that gender essentialism, that gender binary or sexual binary. It's not that simple, as these topics are studied more and more across various societies. And so there's evidence for normal variations once we explore the intersections of gender identity, or a label determined by how we think and feel in terms of masculinity and femininity, in terms of gender expression, how we present based on socioculturally defined external representations of such masculinity and femininity, as well as primary sex characteristics such as having a uterus and ovaries or testes. So this includes the push to assign a sex when genitalia is ambiguous at birth. Most people only focused on physical attraction, who someone has sex with, specifically, when discussing the topic, but we have to also consider emotional attractive as another factor. So once it's, in this case, it's beyond just sexual desire. We have to focus that people do love each other for who they are within their own with gender identity. Because oftentimes people ask, why does it have to be so many different labels now? People often find comfort and a sense of belonging when they know that there are others just like them. And I will briefly discuss some terms used across the normal variation of gender and sexual orientation here. But here, for example, lesbian, of course, describes a woman who's attracted to other women. Gay describes a person who is attracted to people within the same gender. Bisexual, person who's attracted to people within more than one sex, gender, or gender identity. Transgender is someone whose gender identity or expression is different than others, than their sex assigned at birth. Queer, I talked about how I'm using the term as an umbrella term for the spectrum of identities. Questioning folks are there just that who are exploring their sexual orientation and gender identity. Intersex was previously termed, hermaphrodite, for example, but it's a person who is born with differences in their sex traits or reproductive anatomy that don't fit the typical definitions of male or female. Pansexual, a term that describes a person who may have an attraction to people of any gender, to spirit, as I gave a couple of examples. A person who are male, female, or intersex, and carry both male and female spirit within them. A stands for asexual. Oftentimes people think that someone who's not attracted physically to someone is a disorder, but it's just another variation within human sexuality. And then, of course, an ally is anyone who supports who does not identify with any of these labels, and but does support the community. So despite better understanding of this variation of gender and sexual diversity, folks still experience behavioral health disparities. Just some quick stats here, if you will. Having higher incidences of mental illness or suicide rates, especially among LGBTQ youth, when they're experiencing family rejection, compared to those who do not experience that rejection. And in terms of substance use disorder, in order to cope with these pressures of society and such rejection, they might use substances, of course, and having, once again, higher incidences of substance use disorders. And some of this literature actually really points out to the fact that folks who identify as trans or bisexual are also have higher, even within the community, have higher disparities in comparison to their peers. And so that's some research that really needs to, and intervention that needs to really happen at this point. But what do we know overall about LGBTQAI and SUD disparities? We don't know very much. But what we do know is that the stressful life experiences and discrimination does contribute to SUD disparities. So here I turn to the consideration of social determinants of health. And social determinants of health are conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. And these conditions can include factors like economic stability, like employment, income, debt, medical bills support, or education access and quality, such as literacy, language, early childhood education. In terms of social and community context, are they experiencing discrimination, incarceration? Do they have support systems? And in terms of healthcare access and quality, insurance coverage, for example, is a big issue. Provider linguistic and cultural competency, quality of care, et cetera. And then in terms of neighborhood and built environment, there might be housing issues, transportation issues, safe places to be, et cetera. So the social determinants of health are not only relevant to physical health, but also play a huge role in mental health outcomes and substance use disorders, of course. And here I turn to issues of minority stress, which are chronic stressors, once again, like prejudice, stigma, discrimination, and which in turn contribute to anxiety, depression, and substance use, once again, as a coping mechanism. Social isolation, once again, and rejection. Those who experience more are going to be experiencing bullying or harassment, which can often lead to feeling isolation. As we know in today's world, isolation, is a huge factor in determining our mental health outcomes, but of course impacting our self-esteem, and then increases that vulnerability to substance use. And lack of access to affirming healthcare, once again, barriers that include cultural competency and cultural humility as well. That can lead to unmet needs, unmet mental health needs, and increased reliances on substances. So some LGBTQAI plus folks do not have these social spaces, and so sometimes the spaces, there are higher rates of substance use, creating an environment where it's normalized and even encouraged, leading to increased risk. And queer communities experience violence and trauma linked to their sexual orientation or gender identity, and can have that significant impact on mental health and increase the risk of substance use disorders. And in places where queer rights are not protected, where discrimination is essentially legal, individuals may experience that additional stress and marginalization, and once again, contributing to mental health issues and substance misuse. And so this whole concept of trauma, scholars have only more recently applied the concept of colonialism as this distant social determinant of health, and it contributes to the issues we see to this very day regarding anti-queer rhetoric and the impacts on health and well-being. And as such, the gender binary contributes to many adverse experiences throughout the lifetime that can contribute to symptoms of PTSD. So now we bringing in the concept of intersectionality. Oftentimes we only take one identity at a time, but when we talk about minority stress, we're talking about multiple marginalized, minoritized identities. So folks who are queer and a person of color experience very unique challenges at this intersection, which in turn impact their behavioral health. So there's these multiple layers of discrimination, stigma, and prejudice, once again, based on race, gender identity. We might even intersect ability, for example. Again, leads to increased vulnerability to mental health issues. I'm going to repeat here again, barriers to access care. After encountering these systemic barriers to accessing folks who specialize in this community's population, or aren't able to, oftentimes they're not able to receive affirming mental health care. So there's a lot of providers who lack this understanding of the unique experiences and barriers. And so what it ends up happening is folks who are a person of color as well as queer might mistrust healthcare systems due to this historical and ongoing discrimination. And many BIPOC LGBTQ plus communities face a rejection and stigma from both. So they're facing that from their racial, ethnic, and cultural communities, and as well as the queer community itself. So it's this double marginalization, and so impacting their sense of belonging and really contributing to those mental health challenges. And so, of course, we hear a lot about homophobia, transphobia, both within their own community and outside of their own communities. And so these unique stressors really required a tailored support and understanding. So we really need to take an intersectional approach that acknowledges and addresses the complexities of these experiences, including, once again, cultural competence and affirming mental health care, addressing systemic barriers to care, creating safe spaces and supportive spaces where their multiple identities are valued and celebrated. This particular information here is based on one article on addressing systemic racism and substance use disorder, because the application of social determinants of health on substance use is fairly, recent. And this particular article that I'm referencing was only written in 2020. And it speaks on the unequal burden that folks of color face. They're facing disproportionately higher rates of substance use disorder in terms of morbidity, mortality, and adverse social consequences when we're comparing them to white or Anglo populations. Once again, this highlights the barriers to treatment for folks of color, in particular for medications like bupropion for opioid use disorder. It is lower in communities with higher proportions of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous residents. But this has historical and legal roots. The historical context of U.S. Drug policies are very much rooted in racism and discrimination, which has created lasting systemic barriers and fueled disparities in SUD communities. In SUD outcomes. And then systemic racism is not only at the individual level, interpersonal level, but institutionalized and even at the structural level in terms of policy. So in every institution, from housing to education to healthcare, once again, creating vulnerability to substance use disorder in marginalized communities like LGBTQ plus communities. Racism and discrimination is just a chronic stress, creating this trauma historically and generationally for marginalized groups. And there's still a lot of implicit biases held by healthcare providers, which can influence the treatment decisions and can contribute to disparities in access and quality of care that's provided for individuals with substance use disorder, and double much so with folks of color and folks with marginalized gender or sexual orientation. In that regard, we need to acknowledge the systemic isms that occur at multiple levels, really move towards improving access to evidence-based SUD treatment, particularly in underserved communities like the queer communities and people of color, and address these barriers to care, not even being culturally competent within queer experiences. And we really need to address provider biases. Later on, I'll provide a link to a short reflective survey that you might take yourself, and I'll post it in the chat at that point. But trainings like this is really important. It's not just a one-time thing and to be, just checked off the box. It's a continuation of being currently informed with new information about these communities. And oftentimes, we don't focus on prevention. We need to invest into prevention efforts that target these root causes of SUDs, including social determinants of health, and the promotion of resilience in communities of color, and also queer communities. And so New Mexico has many protections in place that support the lives of queer community members. And more recently, there's support for healthcare of transgender individuals. And this brings in the thoughts of, conversion therapy, for example, is outlawed here in New Mexico, or it's not. There's protections against that are banned within our state. And I'll provide the statute on that in just a moment. But we really need to keep up to date with, where we are with our state. And this is chronic, fight for it, no matter what state we are in. And so in terms of services, how to improve services, I was part of the early stages of the Safe Zone project within the Albuquerque public system in my early career as a school counselor. And, at that time, it was so easy to simply put a sticker up on your window and, say, okay, this is a safe space, but it has to move beyond that, the counselor's office, for example, and safe spaces need to be open up everywhere. But in terms of mental health care, one needs to become very self-aware of one's own gender identity and sexual orientation, and et cetera. And so I mentioned that survey, and I'll go ahead and post it at the end here. But essentially, we need to really take time to reflect on all our identities. Also, when you do receive clinical supervision, are these topics of gender and sexual identities explored in clinical supervision? Not only about LGBTQ plus communities, but also all gender and sexual orientations, and so on. We might question, whether our bios and our agency promotions include acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals. And at your intake, does your intake form include a variety of pronouns and sexual identities? And do those identities have definitions? Oftentimes people come in and yes, they might have, they've never really explored that idea about who they are. And that might be a starting point, helping them define, their sexual identity and gender identity. And we have to remember during the whole counseling psychotherapy process that just because someone identifies as queer does not mean that that's the central issue that they're coming in for. I've seen that quite often, and it might not, their issue or their problem might not necessarily relate to their gender or sexuality. And then we also need to move beyond the therapy room. Once again, creating the safe zones takes a lot of advocacy. But we also advocate in terms of helping with filing complaints about discrimination and harassment. And once again, advocating for breaking the gender binary. We have to take into consideration at each developmental phase as well, where I've mostly worked with children and adolescents and some young adults. But within child and adolescence, there's a lot of identity exploration. Schools might not always be a safe place to be, no matter how many clubs that support this community exist. They will need safety across the board. How can we extend that outside of the school grounds or school campus? Of course, we hear lots about bullying and social isolation for young folks. And again, once again, family acceptance is going to be quite the critical point. As you saw earlier, there's a higher incident of suicide rates among young people who are not supported by their family. Just to give you a quick, important little story about a young person I worked with. I was working at a middle school as a school counselor, and they were receiving mental health care, and they were receiving a lot of services based on their disorder, right? The depression and anxiety. However, this young person was displaying a lot of behavioral issues in school and not getting along with anyone. And I ended up taking this young person into my care and started focusing on the LGBTQ plus issues, his identity or their identity. And unfortunately was really dealing with a lot of family rejection. And middle school is a time when you start exploring even, dating and so on and so forth. And so we had conversations about that, not necessarily focusing on the depression or the anxiety, but through time, he became, truly themselves and became a lead in high school, um, uh, clubs that supported this community. And it was quite a different person within just once we were able to focus on the root issues here. Was able to actually do some work with the family as well outside of the school setting. Needless to say, as we transition into adulthood, coming out becomes a bigger issue. I myself, I'm constantly coming out at every presentation that I do on this topic. And one never knows if it's a safe place to be. And so young adults and throughout one's lifetime has to negotiate, what safe places, where can one share who they are openly. There's an increase in development of intimate relationships and how you negotiate healthy relationships, dealing with the coming out process in workplaces and microaggressions that come along with that. And how do we address the mental health, addressing the trauma and stigma and discrimination that they've experienced up until that point. Some issues during adulthood, are these generational cohort effects. Always reminded by my elder queer community members who will not use the word queer, for example. It's very much a derogatory term for them, and younger folks tend to really embrace that identity. But older folks in general just deal with more and more social isolation as they lose other folks. I grew up during the 80s and in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. And so there are many folks my age right now that, have lost a lot of people throughout time. But luckily, of course, with new medications have been able to, keep their friendships and relationships for a longer period of time. But these are still in the minds and thoughts of our older generations. They're taking more time in the healthcare system, long-term care. Are they going to be accepted in the homes that they might end up at? Do they have safe spaces there, for example? Are there all other folks who identify as queer that might be of support within? And then, of course, many folks are not, because of family rejection, have disconnected completely from their family of origin, and their chosen family might be a focus of interaction and therapy counseling. So I mentioned a little bit about affirmative therapy, and it's designed to support, empower the queer community. And it really focuses on the therapist creating a safe space where the client feels comfortable exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity without any judgment. And the therapist affirms that all queer communities are valid and healthy, going along with the normal variation theory. And Therapists also helps clients build on their strengths and resilience to navigate challenges related to their sexual orientation and gender identity. And this might involve coping with the societal pressures that I mentioned, like discrimination or coming out experiences. And the therapist also works with clients on issues unique to the queer community, much like I mentioned earlier. Again, relationship challenges, family acceptance, navigating healthcare systems, and then cultural competency. So, are we continuously taking training like today to continue to be knowledgeable about queer issues, and of course using practicing our inclusive language. So overall, affirmative therapy aims to improve mental health and well-being, reducing that isolation and shame, increasing self-esteem and self-acceptance, and helping people to live authentically, be their true selves, and to be confident with who they are. But we can go beyond this as well. And I mentioned, intersectionality and being able to look at these interrelated identities of race, ethnicity, culture, class, gender, spirituality, religion, ability, etc. Each of these aspects really impact, one's idea of who they are. And of course, every culture or not every religion will be as accepting, but some folks who are maybe more spiritual, really need the comfort of that belongingness to, let's say, a church or whatever it may be. And then, of course, practicing cultural humility. Sometimes because these intersections really display the complexity of human nature and human identities, right? We cannot understand everyone's experience, and it's okay to come from a I don't know standpoint. And even if a clinician is part of the queer community, we don't know everyone's specific experience. And so being open with that is critical, and learning alongside with your client can be critical when coming from this culturally humble perspective. But in part, we also have to hold our institutions accountable, once again, to those historical power structures that have contributed to stigma and discrimination. And of course, ultimately, negative behavioral health outcomes. So I talked a little bit about gender trauma, for example, and this has been experienced collectively, but so more and more we're becoming trauma informed, which is, trauma TIC acknowledges trauma's widespread impact. So recognizing the trauma symptoms and prioritizing safety, trust, collaboration, empowerment, et cetera, in all the care that we provide. We try to create those safe spaces that affirm the queer identities, but also building trust through being transparent and that non-judgmental support. We foster peer connections, either in person or through online communities. We might promote collaboration and empowering clients' choices. And then acknowledging the impact of this collective historical and cultural trauma on queer communities. So yes, we're all being trauma informed at every level. I just recently, actually, here at UNN in the School of Medicine, where it was a mandatory training on being trauma informed. And that's only one side of the coin here. And so one way to expand TIC is taking this healing-centered engagement. And essentially, this is where we are centering culture and identity. So healing is grounded in cultural traditions and practices and values. Healing-centered engagement recognizes that culture and identity do provide a sense of belonging, meaning, strength, all of which are crucial for healing. So we're going beyond quote unquote treatment here. And we also heal through the context of supported relationship and communities. So HCE emphasizes the importance of fostering connections and building these social networks to promote healing and well-being. We focus on strength and resilience. So we're not focusing on the trauma per se or deficits or pathology, but we're focusing on strength and resilience. Recognize that queer communities do have inherent strengths and resources, and leveraging those can help that healing and growth process. We promote agency and self-determination through HCE. So we're, again, empowering individuals and communities to take control of their own healing journeys and to make their own choices that align with their values and goals. Promoting self-advocacy is another skill that, we oftentimes, leave to the side when we're focused on just trauma or just a disorder or diagnoses. But yeah, self-advocacy and leadership in this whole healing process. HCE does acknowledge that impact of historical and collective trauma, but it recognizes that healing from trauma often requires that addressing the root causes of oppression and injustices at every level. And HCE emphasizes the importance of creating safe and supportive environments where not only just the individual, but individuals and communities can together heal and not only survive, but thrive. So this includes the physical level, the emotional level, the spiritual level, the relational level, etc., as well as the access to resources and opportunities. So in that way, we're taking this holistic approach of well-being that encompasses the body, mind, relational, and spiritual dimensions. So it requires addressing every aspect of a person's life. So this is pretty much a transformative approach to healing that honors the unique strengths and experiences and cultures of individuals and communities. So it's a framework for promoting well-being and resilience in the face of adversity and trauma, not very much well applied still yet to queer communities. So, but still has lots of promise. Another way to better the services we provide to queer communities is to integrate critical queer theories. A lot of these theories coming from sociology, but it challenges the views on sexuality and gender, and really highlighting the fact that that these are social constructs and not necessarily "quote unquote" inherent truths. And in that way, we're deconstructing the binaries. So we critique the way society often relies on this binary opposites of man, woman, gay, straight, and arguing that identities can be more fluid and do exist on a spectrum. And then critical queer theories also expose how the idea of heterosexual norm creates power imbalances and disadvantages people who don't fit neatly into these categories. And then we're also moving beyond identity politics. So some early queer movements focused on gaining rights for specific identities, and such as gay marriage, but queer theory can be skeptical of creating new rigid categories. And so it really aims to challenge the entire system of categorizing people, putting them into little boxes. But it really does have critical queer theories have roots in activism that started in the 80s and 90s, particularly around the time of the AIDS epidemic and gay rights. So overall, it's a tool for social change. Another framework is liberation psychology and psychotherapy, having roots in the work of Martin Barreau, Frantz Fanon, Michael Foucault, who they each focused on or critiqued institutionalized systems of power of such as that of marginalized communities like queer communities. Here are a couple of articles that I wanted to post here for you. I think that are important to just take a look at and to understand it from that perspective. And but essentially the approach is to really focus on social justice and how society impacts mental health, or societal factors impact mental health, behavioral health. And it really moves away from, blaming the individual and almost externalizing, and kind of how do the systems of oppression come into play with the problems an individual or a group of individuals might experience. And so overall, the goal is to empower clients to really challenge these systems. So by really developing critical awareness and of societal issues, which is essentially what concientización is, or critical consciousness, again, externalizing the problem. And then another aspect is to be part of de-ideologizing psychology or mental health in general. So we're really critically examining and removing biases or assumptions and values that may unconsciously influence theories that we practice, put into practice, and research that comes out of all that. It also involves questioning taken for granted assumptions, challenging those dominant narratives, and promoting diverse perspectives to achieve a more objective and comprehensive understanding of human behavior and mental health processes and practices. And taking a step back at things that we take, very dearly, like the DSM, as, problematizing it, meaning that, that not everything should be in the DSM, that we need to really take what values are within that system that we use on a daily basis. And then this last piece of realismo crítico is about helping our clients developing their counter stories, much as I presented earlier, presenting, how does colonialism or non-Western societies impacted other societies around Western societies impacted non-Western societies across the globe. But each individual can recreate their narrative. So in a way, it's about bringing in narrative therapy as well. And so we have to move beyond treatment and curing, and know that healing is really critical, as I've already talked a little bit about. But there's not very much on this topic. We have to acknowledge that complex medical systems existed in pre-colonial societies, and are being reclaimed in modern times here. But they do promote resiliency among BIPOC communities in general. And in the case of, as I mentioned earlier, gender, those who did not live in the binary or don't have or non-conforming, were considered spiritual leaders in their time, and many times they still do to this day. But once again, there's not much research in this area, so much to be explored. And I've already talked a little bit coming from resilient and resistance framework. That's one of the common elements of many of these and not just focusing on the disorder or what's wrong with them, but what happened to them and what systems impacted them. But yeah, for developing strong social supports, positive identity development, and really shifting our focus within our healthcare systems. I mean, we do play a role of creating resilient communities as well. And then, of course, resiliency building tools. But yeah, it's about questioning heteronormativity, fighting for equality, challenging discrimination. And one big piece that we forget once again is that we can do therapy outside of our offices, by helping people be part of larger communities that are protesting for legal rights or doing other advocacy work, or becoming visible through art and activism. And one last thing here is how that we must really consider the ethical issues that come into play. And these are just some here, but we need to be really respectful by using the pronouns, whether on badges or on our Zoom names, etc. Really explore our biases that unintentionally will lead to differential treatment, misdiagnosis, etc. I mentioned how New Mexico is anti-conversion reparative therapy, against conversion therapy. We know that it's ineffective, it really leads to poor behavioral health outcomes, leads to more discrimination, stigma, trauma, so on and so forth. In terms of culture and queer identities, coming out is not always an option or not necessarily. For example, within Latino Hispanic communities, what we've observed is that it's not necessarily, most often, the individual might bring their partner to the family and it's just assumed that they're together, but it's never outspoken. And so coming out isn't necessarily necessary. And it doesn't necessarily equate to, good mental health. Maintain confidentiality. Never disclose someone's gender or sexual identity to others unless they give you that permission. And look at your policies within your own agency, within your own practice, and the institutions you are a part of. And of course, continual training and keeping yourself informed, knowing your limits and being okay with those limits and knowing where those gaps are and taking action towards filling those gaps. And so that is the end of my discussion today, but I would welcome any thoughts, comments, questions, or reflections. And if you want to put them in the chat as well, it's fine.
Hi, Russell. I am a peer support at Santa Fe Recovery Center, and I'm a MSW student online with Highlands. I just wanted to say that I'm impressed that you managed to put like 101 in combination with your actual presentation and do it under time. I'm impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd love your email. There's some organizations I kind of feel like I want to make sure you know of if you're not already a part of them. Just really impressed. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Well, I will go ahead and stop here and make sure you fill out your evaluation to receive